Hello and welcome back to Amplifying Technicians, where amplifying technicians means amplifying communities. You may notice I'm by myself this episode, and so we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're 7 episodes in at this point, and I wanted to take this episode to reintroduce myself. And yes, I did get a new haircut. Thank you for noticing. But I also wanted to highlight a recent study done in my research lab that I think is important and I hope you'll find interesting as well. So, welcome. Hello, my name is Taylor Watterson. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Illinois Chicago Retzky College of Pharmacy. I've been a pharmacy technician, an intern, a pharmacist, and I was fueled by my experiences, namely my experiences sitting in the parking lot before my shift, sobbing and calling my mom, crying, saying, I can't do this anymore. Really, and fueled by these experiences to go to graduate school, really to find ways to solve these problems that me and my peers were facing. So today, I lead my systems-based collaborative research for patient safety or Scripps laboratory or lab, where we take a human factors and macroergonomics approach to examining pharmacy work systems and means of collaboration across geospatial teams. And so I'm really excited to talk to you today about one of our most recent papers that was published in the Journal for Research in Social and Administrative Pharmacy, called Exploring Occupational Fatigue in Illinois Pharmacy Technicians. And before I go any further, I want to say this work could not have been done without the fabulous efforts of Sodom Kim, who led the qualitative analysis and the writing of the manuscript, Johnson Osai, who led the quantitative analysis, Grace Fick, Tara Hensel, Caroline Wojcik, and Emily Hoffins, who helped with the conceptualization, the analysis, and the writing. So if I refer to a we at any point, I'm referring to this incredible, incredible team of individuals and the collaborators in the Scripps Lab. So, you may have guessed from the title, but I am interested in occupational fatigue. I've dedicated the last 9, almost 10 years of my career examining occupational fatigue in pharmacists and now pharmacy technicians. Now, to put very simply, fatigue is your body's biological signal that it needs to rest. I may shorten occupational fatigue to just fatigue while we're chatting, but I mean the same thing. This need for recuperative rest that occurs during, after, or is in any way related to our work that we do. And this fatigue can be described in many ways. There's physical fatigue and mental fatigue, acute fatigue and more chronic fatigue. There's also active fatigue, which I like to describe as sitting in rush hour traffic on Interstate 290 in Chicago when you're trying to monitor a whole bunch of stimuli that are coming in. There's also passive fatigue, which is maybe more you're driving on a highway and you're on cruise control and you have nothing passing you but cows and fields, and you start to notice yourself nodding off from a lack of stimuli. So there's active and passive, or it could just be described as a general lack of energy or even sleepiness. And so all of these feelings make up our experiences with fatigue, and in particular, occupational fatigue, dealing with these feelings that occur while we're at work. And one way that I like to think of it also is as a balance, almost like a teeter-totter between our work demands, that's all the things that we have to do and the time that we have to do them in, and our capacity to do the work. That's all the resources that we might have, maybe personal bandwidth, other personnel, or resources within our work organization. And fatigue occurs when our work demands outweigh our capacity to do the work. We get these feelings of excessive workload and fatigue as a result. So one example I sometimes give is that maybe we have 75 prescriptions in our queue and 5 people waiting in the store and 3 phone lines buzzing, and our drive-through is all the way across the street into the Dunkin' Donuts next door. And on any other day, it wouldn't be a problem. But today, you didn't get enough sleep last night, you forgot your coffee, and you have a floater pharmacist who accidentally flushed the keys to the pharmacy and the controlled substance cabinet down the toilet, all before 10 a.m. You can see how you've tipped the scale. And yes, that story about a floater flushing the keys down the toilet is a real story. It did not happen to me, but it was a horror story that a floater shared with me, and I have been terrified ever since that I'm going to flush keys down the toilet. But anyways, you can see how we've tipped this scale. And occupational fatigue doesn't go without its risks. It's been studied in other professions like transportation and heavy industry, in nurses and physicians. And in these healthcare professionals, occupational fatigue has been associated with negative outcomes like reduced job satisfaction, increased risk for injuries, and even greater likelihood of getting into a car accident on the way home from a shift. There's also risk for patients, such as decreased reaction time and decreased patient experience and increased errors. So we know that occupational fatigue in these other professions is bad. We might be able to guess that occupational fatigue plays a role in community pharmacists and pharmacy technicians as well. So in the paper, we talk a little bit about the quadruple aim, which is an expansion of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, or the IHI's original triple aim, that says to improve patient care, we need to first improve the individual experience of care. 2, improve the health of populations, and 3, reduce the per capita cost of healthcare. So that's the triple aim. But the quadruple aim says that before any of these other 3 can happen, a fundamental prerequisite is improving the work life of the healthcare provider, mainly their well-being, but also their fatigue, and that taking care of the provider is the prerequisite to anything else happening. And so we know that there's this critical need to assess occupational fatigue in our most crucial and accessible healthcare professionals. So I had done work in the past examining occupational fatigue in community pharmacists, but I knew that pharmacy technicians had unique experiences shaped by the type of work that they did, their roles, their organizational power and hierarchy, and the phases of the moon and how patients treated them and what their reaction time was like. And so, to make all sense of all of these concepts of fatigue, and capacity, and demand, and safety, I utilized a conceptual framework grounded in a human factors approach, which is the SEEPS framework, or Systems Engineering Initiative for Patient Safety. And the paper has a really nice figure within the framework, and kind of illustrating this more in a more visual way. And I'd highly recommend that you go check it out. But essentially, within SEEPS, it also follows Donabedian structure process outcomes, maybe if you're familiar with that. But it essentially says that within a healthcare system, there is a structure that's known as the work system. Then there's a process, which is how work gets done, and ultimately the outcomes, such as occupational fatigue. And so the aim of this study was to examine pharmacy technicians' subjective perceptions of occupational fatigue and identify these work system components that likely influence fatigue in these community pharmacy technicians. So we were interested in studying occupational fatigue in community pharmacy technicians that were practicing in Illinois. They did not technically have to be certified in order to participate, but knowing that every state has some requirements and there is a time threshold requirement for when technicians have to be certified in Illinois. But to participate in the study, they did not. They just had to be working there. And there were also no limits on the minimum number of hours that pharmacy technicians might work, or maximum, or the years that they had been working there. And part of this is because of something that we might call survivorship bias. This is this idea that the individuals who have been working as pharmacy technicians for a long time and have been experiencing fatigue are either those folks that are very seasoned and maybe are really hardened and maybe have some sort of characteristic that allows them to deal with these traits better, but also they may have just already left the profession. And so knowing that if we tried to cap the amount of time or the hours that they had worked, we may be missing some really important populations of people who, given enough time, would quit and leave the profession. And so we didn't have any limits on anything like that. The only requirement was that they needed to be over 18, needed to be practicing as a pharmacy technician. Student interns were allowed, mainly because they weren't really differentiated, but we did have a preference for individuals that were practicing as a pharmacy technician, and they had to be able to read and write and perform an interview in English. So we recruited these technicians via postcards, drove all across the state of Illinois and dropped off flyers at 61 pharmacies, and then mailed an additional 400 postcards to pharmacies. And we were interested in technicians' subjective experiences of fatigue and factors that impacted these feelings. And so we asked them to complete several surveys. There was a pharmacy fatigue inventory that we'd previously developed and validated that examined the mental and physical aspects of fatigue. Then we also used the Occupational Fatigue Exhaustion and Recovery Scale, or OFER, that examines acute fatigue, chronic fatigue, and then this concept of intershift recovery, your ability to recover fatigue from the fatigue in between your shifts. And so I'm not going to talk too much about these surveys, but the findings are all in the paper, and I'd highly suggest that you check them out if you're interested. But I am going to talk about my favorite part of research, the interviews, talking to people really and hearing stories. That's what motivates me as part of my research. And so I love that we got to do a part of that for this study. So we conducted semi-structured interviews, and the interviews asked the participants questions about fatigue, including questions about how they felt or changes that they noticed over the course of the workday. We talked about things at work or at home that might promote or mitigate these feelings. So the interviews took about 30 minutes, and then the transcripts were recorded and analyzed using deductive content analysis. In layman's terms, we took a fairly rigorous approach to color and highlight the interview transcripts, looking for certain topics or codes that were evident from the SEEPS framework. In total, we had 16 participants participate in the interview. They were on average 24 years old, with 81% identifying as women. Most participants were white and had worked as a pharmacy technician for about 2.5 years. And although there was a range, there were some that had been working for a few months and some that had been working for 24 years. 75% of the participants worked in a national chain, and on average, the pharmacy technicians reported filling 425 prescriptions on a typical workday. But again, there was a range depending on the type of pharmacy. And so for our results, the SEEPS framework was used to describe the components of the work system and ultimately led us to 5 key themes, which I want to share a little bit more. First was that the people pharmacy technicians interacted with, these are their colleagues, these are the patients, could both mitigate or exacerbate occupational fatigue. The technicians shared that positive interactions with customers and coworkers motivated them and helped to almost prevent fatigue, whereas negative patient encounters and lack of team cohesion could hinder team function and promote fatigue. There are a lot of quotes in the paper, but one I particularly like was from participant 14, who said, "A lot of customers or patients can be very abrasive and very rude, and they'll yell or things like that. Sometimes I'll be completely fine, and then a customer will come in and yell at me over something very minor that I have no control over. That's when it really gets to me. It's like, I'm sorry, this was not my decision, you know?" The second theme was that breaks can reduce fatigue, but high workload often prevents timely rest. In general, pharmacy technicians reported that breaks were helpful, and especially designated lunch breaks helped to allow for recovery during their shift. However, staffing shortages and time pressures, and even maybe an unsupportive work environment, but also workplace norms often prevented them from taking adequate mid shift rest. So there was another quote from a pharmacy technician who stated, "But like breaks, not myself. And most of my technicians hardly ever take our 15-minute break because we choose not to. And that's on us. But the reason we do that is because 15 minutes out of a pharmacy is, I mean, being short a person for 15 minutes or, it can mean the difference between getting your stuff done for the day or not. I mean, and you might go on a 15-minute break and come back, and there might be 10 people at the front counter and 6 cars at drive-through. So they were highlighting this point around how it's almost easier to not go on your break because when you come back, you're just going to have more work to do. The third theme was that organizational values sometimes conflicted with pharmacy technicians' values and well-being. The technicians shared that chronic understaffing contributed to consistently high workloads. Some did share that their pharmacies motivated their workers with morale-boosting efforts and helped their pharmacy technicians feel that their work mattered. Something I also found interesting was that sometimes the values of the organization and the priorities of the organization could conflict with what matters to employees or how they were supposed to maybe interact with patients. And so this is another quote from a participant. I am reading off of a paper of the manuscript. I'm not looking off into space being super inquisitive, but this is a quote from a participant who said, "There was, in our training modules, always giving and caring to your patient. Trying to cater to whatever their needs does get fatiguing or exhausting. We'll see that you're always giving and giving. Sometimes when you give to people that are very rude, you're just like, expletive. I shouldn't have been nice to them, but I don't want to be rude back to them. At the same time, you're like, no, you are at work. You got to stay professional, even though they could throw trash at you. They could talk really mean to you. And this participant was talking about how their organization really valued kindness and giving to their customers and giving to their customers, but that sometimes the customers were really rude and throwing trash, as in this example. And so sometimes that can cause a lot of friction. Another pharmacy technician was saying about how sometimes their organization would try to prioritize certain metrics, or not necessarily metrics, but certain promotions, promoting certain products or certain vaccines that either they didn't agree with or they had questions about or just weren't sure that they wanted to promote. And so sometimes these organizational conflicts could get in the way. The fourth theme was that the physically and mentally nature of and taxing nature of pharmacy technician work could be mitigated through supportive infrastructure. The technicians shared that prolonged standing and extended screen time exerted physical stress on their bodies. They reported that the frequent multitasking reduced their cognitive focus and led to task inefficiency, and a limited and cramped workspace worsened their fatigue. However, they did identify that appropriate use of tools and technology, as well as a well-designed workspace with pharmacy technician input, can improve work efficiency while reducing fatigue. One exemplar was from a participant who was able to be on site when a new computer system and printers were being installed. And they stated, I know when some people come to our pharmacy, they're like, oh my God, you guys have the perfect space, the perfect distance. They're talking about the distance between the printer and the computers and everything. I'm like, it was not easy. You had to be on top of the guy installing it. I'm like, I'm sorry if you gave me a dirty eye, but I'm the one who's going to be dealing with this every day, not you. You're going to be gone. I was like, can you please put the printers at a normal height so that we don't have to keep bending down every time just to grab the paper? Things like that. Again, so talking about how the pharmacy could be well designed, but specifically taking input from the technicians or the folks that are working in the front line and actually using it. All right. And the fifth and final theme that the paper highlighted is that employee quality of work life is closely related to patient outcomes. The pharmacy technicians perceived that their fatigue level tended to be related with more errors, and errors could compromise patient safety and reduce the quality of care. They shared that inefficient workflows, driven by their fatigue, could lead to increased wait times, negatively impacting the patient experience. This was a pharmacy technician who shared, and it also puts patient safety at risk. And they should tell. They should be able to tell that by seeing the rise in mistakes that have happened. You know, at our store alone, I know that we've had a huge rise in mistakes, and it's because we're all trying to do too much. And so, what can be done to address pharmacy technician, pharmacist, pharmacy staff in general, occupational fatigue? I never want to end on a bummer, but what can be done? And so, we can take a human factors and work system approach when discussing ways to mitigate fatigue and its risks. And these are often summarized by a fatigue risk management system. And the fundamentals go back to this, again, this balance between our work demands and our capacity to do the work. And as I mentioned, fatigue exists when there's an imbalance. So ideally, we would mitigate fatigue by rebalancing the scales or tipping it back in the other direction in favor of increased capacity. So the first and the most preferred way to do this is to reduce the work demands, totally eliminating this negative weight of workload. Maybe totally eliminating tasks is unfeasible, so instead we offload tasks to other trained personnel or remote personnel, or who knows, maybe this will be a role for AI and computing. But maybe reducing the work demands isn't possible. The next strategy would be to vastly increase our capacity to do the work. Looking at ways to potentially hire and recruit and keep new employees is one approach at improving capacity. But you may say, well, Taylor, these just aren't possible. We can't change the number of tasks that we have to do, and we can't hire more people. Other strategies state that, well, if you can't prevent fatigue by reducing the demands or increasing the capacity, we should at least attempt to mitigate the negative effects of fatigue and potential patient harm. This may be having safety mechanisms in place, like alerts or barcode scanning, that will help you to catch any errors from reaching the patient, even if you are in a fatigued state. And finally, we can help to educate employees on personal strategies that they can use to cope with fatigue, such as sleep hygiene and caffeine and mindfulness strategies. But we also recognize that these strategies are kind of like putting a band-aid on a bursting dam. It doesn't really solve the problem, it just helps to cover it up. And so, with any study, the findings need to be considered in light of its limitations. Their number of technicians was fairly small, and they were mostly at chain pharmacies and in Illinois. But it also emphasizes some important findings, something we point to a lot in macroergonomics. This fatigue and broader well-being problem isn't just the individual. Even when we offer breaks, the culture and the norms is that we don't take them. And so, to get at the root of these issues, we need to think bigger, at larger systematic changes. And when we're making these changes, we need to have the voices of our pharmacists, our technicians, our patients in the room. To me, that's what amplifying technicians looks like. So that's all for today. Once again, thank you. Thank you to the amazing team of trainees and the staff in the script labs for making this work possible. Please feel free to share and interact with the podcast, with the paper. Are these experiences similar to your experiences? Have you found ways to create a culture that prioritizes safety and the health and well-being of the healthcare professional, like the quadruple aim? Thanks all. We'll see you next time on Amplifying Technicians, where amplifying technicians means amplifying communities.